Alright. Well, I've already been introduced. My name is Adrian Crenshaw. A few special thanks. First of all, thanks IU for having me, and Dr. Cooper for being my advisor. Also, Tenacity Solutions gave me a little bit of financing to buy some of my equipment for doing this project. PJRC, who actually makes some of the microcontrollers I experiment with, also provided some stuff. And the Kentuckiana ISSA, who was kind enough to actually pay for my trip to DEF CON. Well, pay for my plane ride. Tenacity paid for my hotel room. Alright, a little bit about me. I run IronGeek.com. Specialize in computer security videos, a lot of articles and whatnot. I have an interest in InfoSec education. I don't know everything, I'm just a geek with time on my hands. Occasionally I'm going to get things wrong. And if I do, let me know. I'm also an irregular on the ISD podcast. They have a podcast 5 days a week. And this particular presentation is on malicious hardware, specifically USB. Now, I like to refer to this as Maltronics. Think of it as hardware instead of software, although ultimately software is involved because any kind of hardware at this level, it's going to be firmware and whatnot. A few possible examples of malicious hardware would be things like PS2 keyloggers, backdoored routers, triggered self-destructing hardware, and perhaps weakened crypto chips. But a little background on USB, because we're going to be concentrating on malicious USB devices. USB hardware generally has various identifying strings that help the OS figure out what drivers to load. It has to represent itself as something when it's plugged in, otherwise there's no way the PC would know, the PC operating system would know, okay, this is a mass storage device according to what's reporting to me, so I need to load the mass storage drivers. A few things that pretty much every USB device has is a vendor ID and a product ID, and these are actually assigned to different vendors. You can go out to on the web and find a listing. The best listing I've personally found is at linux-usb.org. But keep in mind that just because something says the particular vendor made a device doesn't necessarily mean it's the case. I'll show you that in a bit. And also a lot of times serial numbers, which we're going to be showing off a little bit later when we talk about locking down USB. Okay, so why am I concerned about malicious USB devices as opposed to some of the other types of malicious devices you could conceivably make? First of all, there's more real examples as opposed to scale monitoring. I've seen some people talk about backdoor routers coming from the vendors in other countries and whatnot, but I haven't actually seen a real-world case yet. Someone may actually have a correction for me for that, but a lot of the things people talk about, yeah, it's possible, but I haven't seen real-world examples. I've seen real-world examples, at least, of a lot of the devices I'll be talking about today. Also, ease of installation. If someone wants to sneak a piece of hardware into a facility, USB is a good option because generally most USB devices are designed to be plugged in and just automatically run. Lack of admin rights needed in a lot of cases. For instance, to install a lot of hardware, like if you want to install a new video card, generally speaking, you probably have to be an admin on the box to do it. But to install a new keyboard, no, just plug it in and it loads the drivers and you're good to go. Also, some of these devices can be made really small, so it's easy to hide from a social engineering standpoint. So you can socially engineer someone into cloning themselves. Alright, I've basically constructed 4 different categories for malicious USB devices, and there could be some arguments on whether or not these need to be 4 or 3, or if you want to branch things out into more categories. But the ones I'm going to be discussing in this presentation are USB mass storage containing malware, U3 thumb drives with either auto-run payloads, hardware keyloggers, and finally, programmable hid USB keyboard dongle devices. Though I normally just call those by their acronym, and we'll cover them here in a bit. Alright, USB mass storage containing malware. This first category, somewhat obvious. USB mass storage device class is a standard way of presenting storage on something that's plugged in. I mean, the name pretty much says it all. This would be an example of something along the lines of your media player likely presents itself as USB mass storage, your camera probably will, your card reader, certain sections of your smartphone when you plug it in, all sorts of different devices, digital picture frames and whatnot. A whole bunch of items all present themselves as USB mass storage devices when they're plugged in. Now, this particular category is different from the second one because the malicious side of it may not necessarily be intentional. It could be quality control issues at the manufacturer. Alright, the way these things are triggered is either via auto run. Everybody's seen that little like auto run INF on a CD-ROM. Well, some other types of removable devices can also have that. So that's one way these particular devices can be triggered and told to run a piece of software off the device. Also, it could be intentionally ran by a user. For instance, if you get a new picture frame, or you give your mom a new digital picture frame, and it has a file on it that says install me for me to work.exe, she's probably going to run that. And actually, probably most of us would run that too. Also, another trigger vector might be the exploitation of a software bug that does something automatically. Something like, let's say, WMF vulnerability a while back that basically just having the preview of the WMF file would cause something to execute, or you could make it execute something. Or the more recent link file vulnerability. Basically, someone opens up the mass storage, it hits this particular file, and because of this vulnerability in how Windows Explorer works, it automatically executes the malware. All these are possible vectors. Now let me give you some real-world examples of when this has actually happened. The Mariposa botnet was found on various Vodafones when they were shipped from the manufacturer. Also, some various Apple Video iPods also were found with malware on them, and digital photo frames and other gadgets that had this particular problem in the past. Now, these ones are not as interesting to me, partly because the detection and mitigation side of it is fairly well understood. First of all, you have your user awareness, and anybody who's actually worked in security, realizes how tough that one can be to pull off. Disabling auto-run goes a long way. That doesn't necessarily fix the problem of people just running EXEs off the mass storage, but it helps mitigate some things. Of course, staying patched and up-to-date would help solve problems like that linked file vulnerability I was mentioning before. And of course, running anti-malware and antivirus systems on a system will also help keep this from happening, assuming that it's a piece of malware that's detected. Also, you can finally lock down what hardware can be installed, and I'm going to be talking about that towards the end of the presentation. Okay, the next category is in many ways just like the first. Basically, U-free thumb drives with evil auto-run payloads. U-free thumb drives were meant to basically be an easier way for people to carry around applications with them. And essentially the way they work is you have a partition on them that looks like a CD-ROM. You can actually write an ISO to it. I think U-free Tools is a good open source utility for manipulating these kind of things in both Linux and Windows. Basically, because it presents itself as a CD, or part of the device represents itself as a CD, you can have an auto-run INF on that can get automatically executed. Though in more modern versions of Windows and other OSs, they've kind of locked this down to where it's not as transparent as it once was. Older versions of Windows XP, you'd plug it in, and if you didn't disable anything, it would just fire it on up. Now, with newer service packs and also newer versions of Windows, it's not nearly as transparent as it once was. But that was its original intention, was to basically make it easier to carry around applications with you. However, attackers can use this functionality to automate various tasks, like hash dumping and possibly installing remote access Trojans. The core difference between this particular category and the first category I presented is intent. The first one may just be the manufacturer screwed up. Somebody, brought in a thumb drive from home, plugged it into a machine that actually is dealing with the manufacturing of the product they make, and got the entire system infected. Now, the triggers for this is pretty simple. Generally speaking, auto-run, or if auto-run is disabled, the attacker could just go ahead and put it in and run the exe himself. Now, the reason an attacker might want to use this kind of device as opposed to just doing anything manually is speed. I've heard of people at like conferences and so forth go up to a vendor machine, plug in a U3 thumb drive, dump the hashes for the passwords out of the local SAM, then take it back with them. And you can automate that a whole lot quicker with one of these thumb drives, U3 thumb drives, assuming that it works. A few real-world examples. Who here has ever seen the Hack 5 video podcast? Give it a those who haven't, go take a look at what they've got. They have made something called the USB Switchblade, and they also have something called the USB Hacksaw. Essentially, they have different payloads out there that do things like dump hashes and whatnot, so you can get the hashes real quick, take it back to your own machine and do the cracking. But this kind of stuff is not necessarily always malicious either. Russell Butterini's work has been on making an incident response payload for U3 thumb drives. Essentially, the idea is this. If you have a machine that's been compromised, there's all sorts of information that, while it's up and running, might help you figure out who the attacker is or how it got compromised. However, if you're leaving it up and running, it could possibly be attacking other machines in your network or other people's machines out on the internet, which could be a liability issue. So you have this, dueling battle between stopping the problem and figuring it out. So here's a little compromise. Is a U3 incident response switchblade, which you plug in, and it dumps a ton of information about what processes were running, maybe event logs, a ton of information that can be useful. Then you can strip the machine down. And a nice thing about this, and while it's not as perfect as having a real incident response person there, he can have this off at some remote facility that's like a 3-hour drive away and say, okay, that machine's hosed, plug this in, collect the data, and shut it down, and I'll be there shortly. And also, another example that's being used is, I have no idea how to pronounce this gentleman's last name. Anybody who's been with me in the privacy course knows I'm terrible at pronouncing anything. Stephen Strastowski? Sakonis? Anyway, he works for Secure Network Technologies, and he was on a pen test once, and I believe it was for a bank or credit union of some kind. And what he did was, someone on his team developed a custom piece of malware to put on a bunch of U3 thumb drives. Then he left them around the parking lot. And these people would take them and go plug them in. And he had, like, if I recall correctly, like a close to 100% success rate of people plugging these in. And antivirus isn't going to do anything for that because it was custom written malware that they didn't know about. Maybe good egress filtering on the firewall would have helped, but not a whole lot could have been done as far as anti-malware is concerned. Well, that's not 100% true, but let's just go with it. Also, even if someone's using prepackaged malware, if it supports various types of obfuscation, like let's say it's a Metasploit payload. Have you heard of Shikariganai? Or who's heard of Metasploit? All right. Metasploit is a framework for writing exploitation software. And I'm pretty sure H.D. Moore would cringe at the way I said that. It does a lot of things, but one of the things you can do is dump a payload, you can like choose an exploit, choose a target, choose a payload, fire it off, and get something back. Like it could be a VNC connection, it could be a interpreter shell, which allows you to do all sorts of things to control the machine, tons of different things. You can also generate your own EXEs with these payloads already in them. Well, in either case, you can use a tool called Shikariganai inside of Metasploit. And Shikariganai is apparently like a Japanese term that means something along the lines of nothing can be done about it. And what it does is it obfuscates the EXEs so that it's close to impossible to detect. Play with it sometime on it's a website called Virus Total. Make something with Shikariganai sometime and upload the Virus Total and see how many AV engines actually detect it. But let's go on to detection and mitigation. Once again, user awareness is one thing. If your employees know not to plug in every single thumb drive they found just laying around on the ground, that would probably go a long ways. But sometimes users don't necessarily listen. You can also try disabling auto run. That's going to help, but not necessarily going to totally mitigate the problem. For instance, someone might have an EXE on that particular thumb drive that says, I'm a really cool game.exe, and they're going to double click and run it anyway. Also keep your patches up to date. And antimalware and antivirus systems can help depending, but if it's a completely custom written payload, probably not. And finally, locking down the hardware that can be installed. Now, those two other ways, why am I going to focus on the last two categories? Well, first of all, anti-malware is relatively understood. I mean, there's some people who say that antivirus is pretty much dead because of so many ways that people have bypassed them, and writing your own custom code will largely do it, and some of them are really, let's say, buggy to say the best, and annoying to run. But anti-malware is fairly well understood comparatively, and ultimately what we're talking about with these first two categories is a piece of software that's running off of storage. Conceptually, it's not really that different from back in the olden days when people carried around viruses on floppies. So from that standpoint, it doesn't interest me too much. Hopefully, if anti-malware packages from various vendors are already kind of focusing on these sorts of issues. And auto-run issues have been covered a lot in various places. Most people know about the dangers of this at this particular juncture. So the next two categories don't really rely on malware directly, nor do they rely on auto-run to function. The third category I'm going to talk about is hardware keyloggers. Basically, hardware keylogger is a fairly simple device conceptually. You plug it in line between your keyboard and your computer. And actually, just make sure these all get back to me. If anybody wants to see a whole collection of them. Apparently, if you have a website that gets a few thousand hits a day, and you start asking vendors, would you please send me free stuff? They will. So I got about $600 worth of hardware keyloggers here. If you want to pass them out and see what they look like, feel free to take them out of the bag. Just make sure they all get back here when they come around. But these plug in line and essentially sit there and, as a man in the middle, look at all the traffic, all the keyboard traffic, and log it to onboard storage. And then later on, you can get it back in a couple of different ways. Some of them you have to hit a certain key sequence, and it will turn into a thumb drive that you can then copy a TXT file off that has all the keystrokes in it. Some other ones, and actually most of them do this, you hit certain keystrokes, and what it'll do is it will start typing out all the keystrokes it's recorded. And what you do is you bring up Notepad or VI or Emacs, some sort of war here. VI, Emacs. Okay, even if it's not funny or there's no Unix people in the room. All right. Start a holy war between people about what text editor is best. VI. VI? But anyway, bring up a text editor and basically types all the logs out. No problem. And basically, the people are looking for things like passwords, activity, like what the person's been doing on the system and whatnot. And one of the things that really gets me is people who sell these devices. Not that I have a problem with people selling them, but it's the way they sell them, and they say, keep track of your kids. Well, if you want to keep track of your kids, there's better NetNanny-like software you could probably use for that. They also say it's a backup for writers, so in case you lose your document, you can recover it this way. I don't know about how you write, but I write some stuff up here in my article, some stuff up here, up here, up here. I would never be able to use this as a backup solution. Basically, the BSing, mostly these devices are for people to spy on the significant others. Or possibly the boss, teacher, whatnot. Alright, trigger vectors, they don't really have a vector as far as logging. Essentially, they just log everything that goes through them. But to actually recover stuff, you hit a certain key combination. For instance, in the case of key carbon, by default, you type in phx log, and it starts typing out the stuff for you. In the case of the key log, which in my personal experience has been one of the better ones as far as price to performance, you hold down KBS, and it becomes a thumb drive. You can copy off a text file. By the way, these key sequences, they can be changed. I'll mention how that works. A few real-world examples. Unfortunately, I haven't got a whole lot of people to come up and admit to me that their particular organization has been compromised by hardware keyloggers, but there certainly seems to be enough people selling them online, so I know someone's using them. But, people don't like to admit when they get pwned. Alright, now the practicality of actually using a USB hardware keylogger varies from the attacker's perspective. It depends on who they're going after. I mean, the prices can be kind of high. One of the cheaper ones was like $60, and a lot of them are over $300. That's kind of pricey for a device that an attacker might have to leave behind. Also, they're going to have physical access for a very short time. But there's a few exceptions to this. But they have to have physical access for a short time to install it and possibly to retrieve it. There's some people who are working on hardware keyloggers that also use wireless. Like I have a model in there someplace that uses Bluetooth. And the idea is you could come up later on with your phone and basically you needed physical access to install it, but to get the documents later on, all you had to do was get close to it. But the ones I've tested so far haven't worked particularly well. There's also a few ways that you might be able to socially engineer someone to do it. As far as USB hardware keyloggers are concerned, USB is a little bit tougher spec to implement correctly. Sometimes you'll plug in a hardware USB keylogger and it would totally screw up anything else in the chain. For instance, the keyboard may not work right, or if the keyboard has a hub built into it, so you can plug in more devices, those devices either won't work or maybe they might run at a slower speed. Your mileage may vary. I have several articles out there on these particular devices. Some work better than others. Now, as far as detection and mitigation are concerned, of course, physical security. If someone can't actually get into a facility to install them in the first place, then you don't have much to worry about hardware keyloggers. You can lock down what hardware can be installed, and this will in some case works, but most of the time it won't. Most of these devices are completely passive. They don't show up as anything to the computer until they're brought into recovery mode. And quite frankly, an attacker doesn't have to do that on the system that it was logging traffic on. It could be taking it back. He could take it back to his house and then put it in recovery mode. So most of these are completely transparent. I have one that isn't transparent, and I think it was the key carbon. And what it would do is it would appear in the device manager, but it would appear as Texas Instruments hub device. That's pretty nondescript. So there's not a whole lot you can do really about locking it down. You can do physical inspection, though you might have to do a fair amount of that because people do design hardware keyloggers that are meant to go inside of keyboards. But that requires a little bit more time to install. And as I was mentioning before, noticing odd problems like USB devices that run at the wrong speed, or if someone decided to be funny and decided to make the USB keylogger have a vendor ID of 666, you probably want to look into that. But you know, there's various oddities you start noticing. Though I'd hate to send this to the average user because then every single oddity they ever encounter when typing, they're going to report to IT, and that would be kind of a nightmare also. Oh, I was mentioning you had to have physical access. There was an exception to this. And I haven't seen someone successfully pull off this particular social engineering attack. I don't know why it wouldn't work. Is everybody here familiar with hardware dongles that are meant for copy protection? Like tools like AutoCAD and so forth sometimes have these special dongles you have to plug in. And what they are devices to keep people from easily copying the software, because you have to have that physical device as well for the software to run. Well, let's say you social engineer someone and say, hey, I want to send you a free demo version of this product. It actually won't even expire. I'm going to send you a dongle along with it. This dongle doesn't even take up any USB ports. You just plug it in line to keyboard, and it takes care of everything. Then 30 days later, when the software actually does expire, and they call you up, you say, oh, I'm going to send you a bad dongle. Send that one back to me, and I'll send you a good one. And at that point, you have the keylog. So that's one potential way of doing it without having physical access. And if you want more information on hardware keyloggers, I have written a whole lot and done a lot of videos on it as well. I actually have like an hour-long presentation on nothing but hardware keyloggers. Like I said, sometimes I have a lot of time on my hands. Let's see. The next category is the programmable HID USB keyboard dongle. Now, I've made this presentation somewhat more G-rated than my one at Freaknik. So I usually call that by something else, but we'll just go with that for right now. Sometimes I also refer to it as a P-HID, as in programmable HID, human interface device. But essentially, these are like simple microcontrollers that act as keyboards when they get plugged in. And they can be used to script a whole lot of different actions, that anything that a keyboard and mouse can do. I have a lot more information on this out there on my website. By the way, I know that particular URL is incredibly unfriendly to type in, so just Google search for site:"irongeek.com programmable HID, and it should be the first thing that comes up. I use these really ugly URLs because it really helps with getting your Google indexing up. Anyway, so why would an attacker want to use one of these programmable keystroke devices? What kind of payloads might they write for it? Well, it'll likely type faster. So if you want to do something along the lines of the U-free attacks I was talking about, like dumping hashes, you could use one of these devices, have it automatically do everything it is you want to do, and you don't have to sit there and type it. So it can type really fast without errors. I actually talked to someone at Freaknik down in Nashville, and they were saying they would use the exact same idea because they have a bunch of headless servers they don't want to have to walk around with a keyboard and monitor for, so they're going to use this to like plug in and send the commands they needed. Even if U3 is turned off, these are still function. These are keyboards. U3 has nothing to do with it. I mean, auto run has nothing to do with it. So they'll still type even with the auto run turned off. Once again, much like U3, should hopefully draw less attention than someone sitting down in front of the terminal world. They just have to reach up behind it, and if they do the right keystrokes to send, plug it in, have it do its thing, and remove it. And it could also be set to go off on a timer, or you know, like let's say you know an administrator is going to be on a particular system in 3 hours. You plug it and you have access to the machine like 3 hours before they do. You could plug one in, and have it wait 3 hours, and then it types those commands in while someone's logged in with administrative privileges. It can also be hidden in other items, which I'll cover here shortly. Just use your imagination. Now that's how you could trigger one. Now what kind of payload does someone want to do with one of these? Well, first of all, there's things like add a user to a box or a domain. So, add an account. Run a program that sets up a backdoor. It can be programmed to automatically go out to the internet, grab a file, and install it. Now, that can be detected by anti-malware engines depending on what kind of payload is being installed. Automatically set the copy files to a thumb drive. Go to a website that the victim has a cookie for. Now, there's something called cross-site request forgery. Now, this is where one website makes a request or has some content on their site that references another site that they think you may use, and it automatically does a transaction for you. Let's say Facebook had a cross-site request forgery problem. Well, you might visit some friend's webpage, and because they have a weird image or a weird piece of JavaScript on the machine, it might make a request. Your browser would make a request out to Facebook to do something, and because you already had the cookies, because you decided to stay logged into Facebook, it could go out and actually accomplish its task. Similar concept here. Let's say someone uses Facebook. You could, in theory, program one of these little devices to automatically go out to Facebook on the machine and do its thing. All right, trigger vectors. And of course, there's time-based lock keys, because that's what the only communications back to these devices I've really found is reliable. Essentially, whenever you scroll lock, caps lock, num lock, whenever those are toggled on and off, that information gets sent to every keyboard hooked to a device. That way it knows to turn off that LED. Light motion or some other environmental conditions, and those are all different vectors. I know someone else at DEF CON was working on making one that uses radio waves. I could just basically trigger it via remote control. Now here's a few different units I've created over time, and I'm actually going to demo them. First thing I'm going to demo, is anybody else here notice this weird mouse I have sitting up here? One of the ideas is to embed this stuff in devices that people like, little cubicle toys or whatnot. Like people have seen those dogs that mount people's USB ports, or people have seen these little glowing globes that people can hook up, or these, nabbits, little like reporting toys that you plug into a USB device for USB port for power, and they do something. There's no reason you can't embed these kind of programmable hits in those and give them to someone as a present. So here is a little mouse I made. Well, okay, technically I didn't make the mouse, but I modified it heavily. Essentially, inside this little mouse, I have a Tinsy device, which I'll talk about a little bit more here in a bit. And I have an LED, an RGB LED that's set there to automatically phase through different colors just because it looks cool. But I also have some storage, a USB hub, and that Tinsy device automatically set to sit there and listen. Now, I have it sit and listen for a lot of different things. I could have it go off our timer, maybe temperature, maybe lighting conditions. But in this case, I have it set to go off on scroll lock. So let's say instead we did this caps lock. Someone suggested this to me. I don't remember the gentleman's name. But let's say someone turns on caps lock because they know it's annoying and they want to know when someone's about to log in. They could turn on caps lock. Someone knows it's caps lock on. They turn it off. Now the device, since it got the message that caps lock got toggled, knows to dump its keystrokes. Oh, another time this sometimes happens. Watch your scroll lock, your num lock, and your caps lock when you log in and out of your machine. A lot of times they'll toggle at that point too. You can use that as a sign to know when a machine's actually been logged in. But anyway, I'm going to hit scroll lock. And I'm going to hope for the best and hope I actually plug that in. All right. Let me temporarily exit out of this and make sure this device is ready to go. Oh, actually I know why. This keyboard's a little different for actually having to hit scroll lock. Okay. Well, this may not be quite as embarrassing as the time my machine blue screened while I was at DEF CON, but Okay, it finally did fire itself up. Now, because something wasn't recognized, though, it didn't properly function. So let's try that one more time. Believe it or not, this normally works reliably. Believe me. Yeah, actually, sometimes live demos can be the bane of my existence. But basically, this thing's supposed to be sitting there and waiting for a scroll lock to toggle. And at that point, go ahead and dump its payload, which in this particular case is to something it doesn't like. All right. What it's supposed to do is drop out to a prompt, bring up Notepad, basically say it's about to copy stuff from the desktop, then issue a command that automatically looks for a thumb drive by its volume label and starts copying stuff to it so I can recover it later on. Unfortunately, for some reason, while I was messing around with my thumb drive earlier, it has stopped working. Possibly I jiggled it around too much. But essentially, this is a little Trojan device that's designed to collect data, and then you come back later on and try to recover this mouse. A different example would be the other device I'm going to show. And keep in mind, this can all be embedded inside of some kind of cubicle toy. I made this little one with a light sensor for the sake of demoing. Now, normally I wouldn't want it to be triggered by just pressing a button, but for the sake of demoing it, I kind of have to know exactly when it's going to go off. Because as you already see, sometimes live demos don't work that well. Now, I set the first thing on this to be just a menu, because I keep forgetting what dip switches I had set for what payload. But let's show a few examples. I've already shown payload 1, which is basically just diagnostic information. Payload number 2 is bring up an application and type in Adrian was here. But because of the low screen resolution, you see how that worked out. Let me grab that and move it to the side. Let's go with payload 3. You can also set it to automatically go to a website. And that's an example of that. And then let's say you have a 0-day for a browser. That might be a possible attack vector. At one time, I had the Facebook post thing working. The last time I checked this, for some reason, the mobile Facebook website takes too long to come up on this network, so it won't actually make the post. But at one time, I had it set up to where when you dump this payload, it would automatically bring up Facebook. Let me check. Do I have the right one set? Oh, I have 4 set. 4 is a caps lock key. I just basically turned on caps lock, and it's waiting for it to be turned off, and to do its payload. Another example. Let me see if the Facebook one will work at all. My guess is it will bring up Facebook, try to do some key sequences, but it won't actually function because it doesn't get Facebook up fast enough. But it doesn't have to be Facebook. I guess it could be someone's bank. But the idea was that it would tab along and eventually get to here, and then share, and then that would post that information to my Facebook feed. Now, I think either Facebook's changed some stuff, or something's happened different in my browser, because the same payload is not working anymore. But basically, if you can figure a way of doing it with the keyboard and mouse, you can make the device do it. And it doesn't have to be something simple like Facebook. It could be a financial application or whatnot. Possibly an admin interface to some device. Oh, I have one that looks for a drive called MyThumb and automatically copies stuff to it, but we've pretty much seen that. I'm going to skip down to 8 for a second. Now, you can also do stuff by motion detection, and basically the way this one works is it's essentially waiting for changes in lighting, like a shadow passed over it. So this is kind of a poor man's motion detection, because it's waiting for like ambient light changes, like my hand moving over it. But it does indeed work. Let me actually bring this up. Actually, I think I got a way that I know it can make this come up automatically in the right location. It also helps if I turn that payload off so it doesn't keep bringing up Notepad over and over again. Actually, while I was at DEF CON, I had this device blue screen a machine. Only time I really would call it doing that particular thing, outside of the time I set one up to have an SD card embedded in it, and it didn't actually have an SD card embedded in it. That caused some confusion. I should have played it off as a deliberate example of how USB devices aren't necessarily well tested by Microsoft. Basically, the idea being is if you get a blue screen, you got some kind of bad memory corruption. If you got some kind of bad memory corruption, you have the possibility for an exploit. So that means people should start looking around for different ways they can use USB as an attack vector. And has everybody seen these little USB dongles for plugging into a PS3 to jailbreak it? It's using attacks similar to that in concept. Alright, let me bring up Notepad one more time. Let me bring it up full screen, then close it, and now hopefully when I do this, it'll actually do the right thing. We'll find out here shortly. I think that's the one I have set to tell me how much ambient light's around, and I can have it triggered by lights coming off, lights going off, or a certain level of brightness, like if I know the noon sun will be on at a certain time right overhead. Right there it says the lights seem to be on. Let me cover the device up. I'm scared of the dark. And you don't have to have either lights on or lights off. It doesn't have to be binary in a sense, either on or off. It could be something a little different. Little demo. So there's all sorts of things you can program one to do. Let me go back to my slides. And I've been working with embedding them in various devices, and that's kind of got me into arts and crafts, is what you see right down here. Trying to cast my own little cubicle toys to embed these devices in. But a few real-world examples, unfortunately, not a whole lot. Basically, the way these devices have started looking into them is I was at ShmooCon 2010, and as a speaker's gift for the Fireside Talks, someone gave me something called a Phantom Keystroker. And this is a prank toy. You plug it into someone's machine, it like turns on off caps lock, occasionally types stuff just to be annoying. But I started me thinking, if I could make something like this that was programmable. So I saw Adrian Crenshaw from Hack 5 there, and I talked to him about it. He said, well, me and DigiNinja from over in Europe are working on this also. And like, oh, okay. And he was going to send me a demo unit. I got impatient and started looking around, and I found the same board that they were going to be using, which is this thing called the Tensy. And I actually have schematics and everything if anyone wants to build their own. And these Tensys can be hidden in anything. Essentially, that's with a bunch of extra peripherals around it, and actually the Tensy++, which has more options. If you just want the base Tensy, like $18 chip, that's the size of it. That's pretty easy to fit into most things. But there's been a lot of talk about using these kind of devices. Besides myself and the stuff that Darren has on his website, along with Robin Wood, that's DigiNinja's real name. Dave Kennedy gave a talk on using these devices while he was at B-Sides in Las Vegas. And essentially what he did is he integrated something into SET. SET is a social engineering toolkit. Essentially it has a bunch of scripts to automatically generate social engineering payloads. Like if you want to clone a website, then ask someone to come to it, it'll automatically send them a Java page that says, hey, this Java applet is signed by Microsoft. Do you want to say yes? But the way those Java applets are signed, you can say it's signed by anybody. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Well, he also made some payloads for SET that you can generate that you can then load onto the programmable HID device. Also, Dave Kennedy and Josh Kelly did something on PowerShell using this device as a way of typing stuff into PowerShell to make it accomplish a task for them. Richard Rushing also gave a presentation at Black Hat on devices very similar to these. Monte Elkins did one where basically he used the device and he made it radio controlled. Of course, there's the Hack 5 Rubber Ducky, and finally my own presentation from DEF CON, which is actually out there on the website already. Alright, detection and mitigations of these. Well, user awareness might go a long way if they just know not to install or not to plug in everything they get. Physical security, obviously if someone doesn't have the access to physically install it, that'll go a long way. Lockdown what hardware can be installed, which I'll be covering here very shortly. Physical inspection for like these kind of devices hanging out the back of your machine, although in some cases they could be embedded in another device, so physical inspection may not get you all that far. Actually, Dave Kennedy and Josh Kelly, where they work, they supposedly hooked up one of these devices inside a coworker's keyboard to automatically send annoying keystrokes, and the guy never figured out where it was. This takes a little bit of soldering skill. All right, USB lockdown. Here's some of the hope. I want to talk about doing things in Linux and Windows because, well, I don't really use OS X. First of all, to lock down stuff in Windows, there's various registry tweaks you can make or policy settings you can change. Basically, there's these whole things about device installation restrictions that you can set. And you can basically get really anal retentive about saying, okay, these particular devices with these particular vendor IDs can automatically install and these other ones can't. Now, blacklists don't work for this particular reason. Someone can clone the vendor ID and the product ID. It's fairly easy to do. Actually, on most of my devices, I think I set mine to like 666.13.13 to be a joke and like say Cthulhu keyboard and mouse device. You know, you don't have to tell the truth. You can actually choose to have Microsoft's vendor ID if you really wanted to. And actually, I ran into some devices. Like I ran into a hardware keylogger once where when you switched it into recovery mode, it would appear as an Apple keyboard. But I'm pretty sure Apple had nothing to do with the manufacturing of that particular device. But you can go in and you can actually get restrictive about what can and can't be installed. Now, my personal recommendations on what to do is not to allow anything to be installed without admin privileges. Have it pop up this particular message that says disabled because Adrian said so, or whatever your equivalent would be. Restricted because of IU policy or whatnot. And basically, to actually have it installed, it won't automatically install. An admin has to come along, go into Device Manager, right-click on it, and say Install. Is that a pain? Yes, but if you have a very high-secured system, it might very well be worth it. The average user probably wouldn't want to go to this trouble, but if you have like a very important financial system, then yeah, possibly might be a good idea. That was the registry keys I was mentioning before to basically get manipulated, but setting it via GPO is probably going to be easier. Alright, and that's that little pop-up I told you about that when someone plugs in a device that hasn't been authorized, what it says. And that's all customizable. But basically my recommendations are allow only administrators to override device installation restrictions, and then also choose prevent installation or removal devices. And you can do all this, like I said, in the GPO settings. Display a custom message so that they know what was going on. And then anytime someone actually has to have something installed, they have to go to the admin to actually go in and have it installed. Yeah, it's going to be a pain in the butt for some systems, but if you have certain systems you really want to keep secure, then, like maybe servers and whatnot, it might not necessarily be a bad idea. And I have a ton more information out there. There's stuff on Microsoft's site about it, and also I wrote a really long article and apparently a really long URL that basically goes through each one of the settings. I tested out each one of them and gave my report, because some of the language they use to describe the different settings you can use is a little hard to understand. So I actually sat there and tested them all and did my own write-up on it. Because, like I said, my recommendations are pretty cut and dry. Don't allow anybody to install anything unless they're an admin. But you can get more restrictive and say you can install USB storage devices but not new keyboards. Or you can install new keyboards and USB storage devices, but you can't install new wireless adapters, which might also be of interest to some people because, ever heard of rogue access points and whatnot? Or people who come into a facility and install their own wireless devices, not realizing they're making a bridge into the network that anybody can access without any restrictions. So there's cases when that might be useful. Alright, you can also do much the same thing in Linux. Luckily, Michael Miller from the Paul.com podcast pointed me in the right direction. I had a few good ideas, but I really didn't know how to do this until he pointed me at a little bit of simple documentation on USB authorization in newer Linux kernels. The first thing you have to do is you have to collect information about what USB devices are on a system, so you can figure out various device strings to choose to authorize on. There's a couple of ways you can do this. I can use LSUSB to figure out what devices are plugged in. I can also cat out, if I want to do just keyboards and mice, cat out all the stuff that's in proc buses input devices. Or I can use UDEV admin to see information about individual devices. And then I can also write a script, UDEV script, that will sit there and whenever something changes, if certain rules apply, it will authorize or deauthorize the device depending. A couple of useful tools in Linux, and that red really doesn't show up now, does it? UDEV monitor and also just tailing out your message log will help you figure out what particular device it is you plug it in, so you know to go look at it and find device strings to trigger on. Now those device strings I'm talking about, let me give an example here. This is a little simple UDEV script I created. I put it inside of Etsy UDEV rules.d, and I called it 01 USB lockdown rules. I called it 01 because I wanted to get it ran before a bunch of the other devices, a bunch of the other UDEV scripts. It still needs some work, so use this one at your own risk. By the way, these slides in a different version, a slightly more PG-13 rated version, are already out on the website. Let's see. Action add, so whenever it sees the action add and the subsystem is USB, run this particular command. And what it does is it goes through every USB device and it echoes 0 into authorize default, which basically says don't authorize anything by default. Automatically make it not authorized. Then the next section says authorize add if the device class is 09, which is a hub type device, go ahead and authorize it. Then I have a few other settings in here. For instance, this particular one, if it sees this particular vendor ID, which I don't remember, may have been from my Logitech camera, automatically authorize it. And a few other different devices. Like this one, I'm looking at serial number. This serial number is something that in theory should be unique on my thumb drive, and I can authorize based on that. One of the problems with actually using these kinds of scripts is people can fake a lot of information if they know ahead of time some information about the facility, like what keyboard they use and what mouse they use, so they can figure out and look up online what vendor and product ID they should set. The serial number is going to be a little bit more difficult, and one of the recommendations we're thinking about making in the paper is that more USB companies that make USB devices include a serial number of significant length to where people can't easily guess that. So you can authorize by serial number, and it'd be much, much harder to slip a device in through these kind of rule sets. I also have a rule in here that automatically lets my USB wireless device run. In this case, I'm triggering by serial number, this case by vendor ID, this case by the product string, which included 802.11n WLAN, and so on and so forth. If you want a lot more information on UDEV rules, you can find it out there on reactivate.net or reactivated.net. And I also have an article. Dr. Gupta doesn't want me to release it in general public yet, but I have a write-up on how to actually make these settings. So if anybody wants it, just email me, and as long as you keep it private, I'll send you a copy of it. It still needs a lot of editing, but it's coming along. Now, I showed you a script that basically lets you, in both Windows and Linux, ways that you can lock stuff down. But sometimes you need to find out more information about a device. And in Linux, that LSUSB and a few other various tools like UDEV admin are going to help. But sometimes you also want to look at your entire network and figure out what USB devices are being plugged in out there. And to do that, it's time to get a little bit Big Brother. Now, I'm concentrating on Windows here. In theory, I guess you could probably script something up in Linux as well. But I've been doing this mostly in Windows. If you want to find information about a device in Windows, you can go underneath Device Manager, but it's kind of a pain to find device strings to key on or find out more information about a device. A better tool that I personally like is USB DView from Nearsoft. It looks something like this particular interface. And not only does it show you stuff that's currently plugged in, it shows you devices that were plugged in before and shows you a ton of information about them, such as the serial number, which is going to come up important in a second. Now, let's say you wanted to collect all this information remotely. Well, one of the nice things about Nearsoft's tools is he's designed a lot of them to be able to work over the network. You basically give in the UNC path to a server or a workstation, and it can go collect the information. So I created a text file that has a few different machines on my network. As you can tell, I'm both a Terminator fan and a HP Lovecraft fan, so I used that particular text file. And then I put all of that in there, and I used the command USB dview, and I told the remote file all the boxes I wanted to check, and I told it to output everything into a comma-separated value text file, which I could then import into some other tool and start looking for anomalies or whatnot. And one of the reasons you might want to do something like this, like who's heard of Conflicker? One of the ways Conflicker got around was it was on thumb drives. Well, if you start noticing, well, we think we found the particular thumb drive that this person was using, or we think that it's being passed around by thumb drive, but we don't know whose thumb drive, you could scan your entire network using this, then find every single machine that was infected and had that particular serial number of thumb drive plugged into it, then find out where that thumb drive was first installed, or where it may currently be actually installed and functioning. Then you have a rough idea of whose thumb drive it might actually be. That would be an example. You can also look for weird anomalies like an Apple keyboard plugged into a Dell machine, or a machine with 2 keyboards, though that would hardly be the best way to go, because sometimes there are completely legitimate reasons to have more than one keyboard. It could actually, may not even be a real keyboard, it may just be a presenter remote or something along those lines. But you can collect all this information, then look for in it for anomalies. And I have another article out on my website on essentially using USB dview for such tasks. Now, as I was mentioning before, there's a few things you can do with all this collected information. Look for suspicious vendor IDs is one. I already covered looking for the Typhoid Mary, the person with the thumb drive that's going around from machine to machine. Or if you happen to find one thumb drive that is infected, you can find its product ID, then scan your network, find out every other place that one's been installed, so you know which machines in your network to go around to and possibly have to clean up. But look for suspicious vendor IDs. Like I say, if someone is, because kind of being a smartass and decides to make a vendor ID of 666, you might want to go investigate that. Or Elite, that would be another one to go investigate. Also, computers with 2 keyboards I'm mentioning, and various other anomalies. If you're interested in this talk and want to see a more playful version of it, I actually gave this presentation at Freaknik 14 as well, and the slides are out there. A few final words. First of all, I'd like to tell you about a few events that are semi-local to you. Some of these not so local. In 2011, we're having a large HackerCon down in Louisville, Kentucky called DerbyCon. We're going to have some pretty big-name speakers there. Probably going to be, we're aiming to be something like an alternative to DEF CON and ShmooCon for people that don't want to have to fly. In my understanding, there's like a huge percentage of the U.S. population that's within driving distance of Louisville, Kentucky. So we're having it there. And hopefully that'll turn out pretty well. The Louisville InfoSec happens every year, so I highly recommend them, and I'm usually involved with their conference every year. Also, SkyDogCon, HackerCon, Freaknik, Notacon, and OuterZone are all other HackerCons I highly recommend going to if you want some technical information. And they're also pretty good times. And finally, questions. Sorry if that was like drinking from the fire hose, but I want to make sure I got everything done in time for questions. Yes?
Yeah. I had read something a couple of years back that Windows had the ability in plug and play to say you plug in a multifunction device like a printer scanner, that it could get the drivers right off of the memory of the device and install them automatically. Have you heard of it?
I haven't played enough of that. I have one device that's like that, but I haven't looked enough into how it does it. I have a Logitech video camera that seems to do exactly that, but it is something I need to do more research on, because that might be a different type of autoplay. But unfortunately, I have limited information on that.
Okay. Yeah, it wasn't documented, but it seemed like, using your device and having memory on it.
Oh, you can do that, because you can actually, you can plug an SD card adapter into the 10C device and have storage on the 10C. Okay. Unfortunately, it only runs at USB 1.1 speeds. So my solution was just to use a USB 2 hub and put them in parallel. And that's essentially what this device was, but for some reason, something got messed up inside of here, and either the hub stopped working, or more than likely the USB storage device I have in here stopped working.
Because it seems like that way you would be able to, you could walk up with a USB, plug it in, and have it actually install the driver and run it as
Yes.
a system account and have full access.
Yes, you can completely do that. Yeah, actually I have that kind of set up in this mouse, but unfortunately for some reason, it worked like a few minutes before my presentation. Well, 30 minutes before my presentation, but for some reason it didn't work at the time. But yeah, you can do that. Yes?
So it's very easy to fake the device ID or the hardware ID
Uh-huh.
with the USB. Aren't there? Have you ever heard of any programs that would like verify the hardware being installed? I mean, isn't there a way that you could like check to see if this hardware is actually?
I haven't heard anything that actually does it. I suppose it can check for more than just the vendor ID, the product ID, and some other stuff. The problem is that those are fairly they're spoofable. So I'm not really sure what it's going to detect on. I mean, the serial number would be harder to spoof because there's a lot larger range, and you might have to actually get, as opposed to like looking at someone's machine and saying, okay, they have this particular Apple keyboard, I know what vendor and product ID to set. If it's like something like a thumb drive, it has a serial number on it. Then again, for all I know, Macintosh keyboards may actually have a serial number on them. The serial number is much harder to look at because you can't necessarily say just by looking at it what its vendor and product ID is. Just looking at it, you can tell what model it is, and then go look it up online what vendor and product ID it is. Does that make sense?
I was just thinking there might be like different vendors or different devices might behave differently.
Well, they will, but the only way you really get, the things that report to you are these device strings. So they do behave differently in that particular way, but there's no reason someone can't clone that information. Like you can clone the vendor ID and product ID. You just have to go into a certain C++ file, in the case of the Tennessee, and edit it to be whatever you like. But I got, like I said, schematics and source code and everything for actually building these Tennessee-based programmable heads if you want more information on it. It's not too difficult, and the nice thing about the Tennessee is besides writing in straight up C, you can also do Arduino, which is basically a bunch of wrappers around C++ that greatly simplify matters. And I have source code and libraries and whatnot out on my website. Anybody else? Yes?
So I guess I'm kind of thinking here, but this would kind of go along with the serial number or whatever. Is there any way to create something to, like a trusted third-party kind of thing to validate? Is that
I was talking about this, and I suppose possible, but there's nothing that's been implemented right now. So getting the people in the next USB spec to implement some of that, I suppose it would be possible. But then, I don't know if you really want a third party to be validating it every single time. There might be some kind of weird challenge response thing you can do, or maybe some kind of signing that you could do, but it's not currently implemented. But it's definitely an area of research I'd like to do a little more looking into. Unfortunately, it wouldn't necessarily be a solution to the problem immediately, because it would have to be requested that all future USB devices use this kind of technique.
right?
And most people don't need this. And those that really do need it, hopefully have decent physical security and they don't let anybody plug in anything to their systems. One would hope. Yeah, but that's one of the things I like to look at, and it's like some kind of real challenge response system that makes something actually work. But I'm not quite sure of how it would be set up as of right now. Not to mention, it'd probably be something that's going to have to be changed in specs. However, the solution of having all devices have a serial number, that's a fairly easy one to implement. Granted, if anybody ever captures the device, then they can clone that serial number, but at least it makes it a lot more difficult. It actually has to get access to someone who has a device that's actually approved at that facility first. But to my knowledge, not all devices have serial numbers. Pretty much every thumb drive I've ever seen does, but I'm not sure all the other devices do. Anybody else?
Does IUPUI have any questions?
No, we don't this time.
Alrighty, well, if no one has any other questions, we want to thank Adrian for coming down today.
If anybody has any questions later, just email me, ongeek@ongeek.com.